The city stood on a narrow spur of limestone ridge above a steep valley, and for 400 years, nobody could take it. Not Joshua's armies, not the tribe of Judah, not Benjamin. Generation after generation had looked up at those walls and turned back. The city was called Zion. Its people were called Jebusites, and somewhere along the way, they stopped even worrying. "You will not come in here," the Jebusites said to David when he arrived with all of Israel. "Even the blind and the lame will ward you off." 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 6. A taunt so confident it passed into legend. 400 years of a city that couldn't be broken. And then one man found the crack in the wall. His name was Joab, son of Zeruiah. The crack wasn't a weakness in the stone. It was a hole in the rock, a vertical shaft carved to carry water from the spring below up into the city above. The Jebusites built it to survive a siege. They never imagined someone would climb up through it. 1 Chronicles chapter 11, verse 6. "Whoever strikes the Jebusites first shall be chief and captain." Joab went first, and a city that had stood for 400 years fell in a morning. But what Joab climbed into, and what David spent a decade building over, that story is still being excavated. Literally. What archaeologists have uncovered beneath the streets of Jerusalem in the last 2 decades rewrites what most Christians picture when they hear the name City of David. There was a moat 35 meters wide, a retaining structure 20 meters tall, the largest Iron Age structure in Israel. A palace built into the bedrock of a ridge you could walk across in 90 seconds. And underneath all of it, a history that begins not with David, but with a man named Abraham, a priest named Melchizedek, and a piece of ground that God had already claimed 1,000 years before a single Israelite ever set foot on it. This is what the ground remembers. Before you can understand what David built, you need to understand what he walked into. Jerusalem in 1000 BCE was not a prize. It was a problem. Joshua 1563 records what happened during the original conquest, 4 centuries before David was born. The Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem, the people of Judah could not drive out, so the Jebusites dwell with the people of Judah at Jerusalem to this day. Judges 1:21 confirms the same failure from Benjamin's side. The fortress on the ridge, called Zion, held through every assault. The entire period of the Judges, the whole of Saul's reign, unbroken. The Jebusites knew this. That's what makes the taunt so pointed. Even the blind and the lame will ward you off. This wasn't arrogance. It was earned history. Stand at the base of the ridge and look up. The Jebusite city occupied a narrow limestone spur, 12 acres at the height of its occupation, perhaps as little as 4 to 6 acres in the fortress stronghold itself. The slope dropped sharply on 3 sides: the Kidron Valley to the east, the Central Valley to the west, the Hinnom to the south. Only the northern approach was level enough to assault, and the Jebusites had been fortifying that approach for centuries. The reason they could hold it was the Gihon Spring, Jerusalem's only perennial water source, running from the base of the eastern wall. Archaeologists Ronnie Reich and Eli Shukran documented the Bronze Age fortifications around it. Massive walls dating back to 1800 BCE, all organized around one goal: protecting access to that water. The Jebusites inherited this ancient engineering. They had built a tunnel system that brought water inside the walls without opening a gate. They could survive indefinitely. Until someone found the Tsinnor. The Hebrew word appears only once in the entire Bible. 2 Samuel 5:8. A water shaft, a conduit. David declared that whoever gets up through the Tsinnor leads the assault. Joab went up first, as recorded in 1 Chronicles 11:4-6. In 2008, Dr. Eilat Mazar's excavation team uncovered an ancient tunnel cut into the bedrock on the upper eastern slope of the city of David. It runs north to south, wide enough for one person, stretching at least 50 meters before debris blocks both ends. Dr. Mazar concluded it was, with high probability, the Tsinnor from 2 Samuel. The Jebusites built it as their lifeline. Joab climbed it in the dark, on the night a city changed hands. Here is what the conqueror inherited when the city fell. 12 acres of ridge, at most, a narrow limestone spur with sheer drops on 3 sides, one spring at its base, Bronze Age towers, a set of walls, and almost nothing else. David moved his household into the Jebusite fortress and called it the City of David. 2 Samuel chapter 5:9 records the transition in a single, almost businesslike sentence. David dwelt in the stronghold and called it the City of David. And David built the city all around from the Millo and inward. That phrase is the key to everything archaeologists have spent a century trying to understand. The Hebrew word Millo comes from a root meaning to fill, a fill structure, something built up from earth and stone. David shaped the ridge before he built on it. He created level ground where there wasn't any. He built a platform on a slope. Then came help he hadn't planned for. 2 Samuel 5:11. Hiram, king of Tyre, sent cedar timber and carpenters and masons, and they built David a house, the most sophisticated builders in the ancient Near East, Phoenician craftsmen sailing timber down the Mediterranean coast to a king on a limestone ridge who didn't have enough trees for a proper floor. The timber arrived. The craftsmen arrived. And something began to rise on this ridge that it had never held before. Walk to the eastern slope of the city of David and look at what remains exposed there. You are looking at the stepped stone structure, 20 meters tall, not a wall, a cascade of stone and compacted fill terraces descending the slope in massive steps, shoring up the northeastern crest of the ridge. Doesn't look like a building. It looks like the ridge itself has been terraced by a giant hand. Stand at the base of it and look up. Then turn and look east, across the Kidron Valley, to the slopes of the Mount of Olives. From there, from the hillside where hundreds of thousands of pilgrims would one day crowd for the festivals of Israel, the stepped stone structure would have been the most visible thing in the city. A declaration carved into the ridge. Something is being built here, something permanent. Scholars believe this is the Millo. The stepped stone structure is built of fill. It descends the slope in exactly the pattern the word implies, a massive raised platform that provided a foundation for everything above it. Biblical archaeologist Nadav Naaman, writing in Biblical Archaeology Review, argued that the stepped stone structure below and the large stone structure above together formed David's royal complex, the Millo as the platform, the palace as the crown. A Phoenician-style pillar capital was found at the base of the stepped stone structure, consistent with the work of Hiram's craftsmen, the very men 2 Samuel says David brought in from Tyre. Which brings us to the structure above it, and to one of the more remarkable moments in the history of biblical archaeology. In 1997, Dr. Eilat Mazar published an article in Biblical Archaeology Review with a quietly audacious claim. She had identified, from a close reading of 2 Samuel 5:17, exactly where David's palace had to be. The text says that when the Philistines mobilized against David after his anointing, he went down to the stronghold. If David went down to the fortress, his residence was above it. meaning the palace sat north of the Jebusite city, on the highest ground of the ridge, looking down over everything he had conquered. She drew a map. She placed a large arrow on it. She wrote the words, "It's there," and then she waited 8 years for funding to prove it. In 2005, the excavation began. Within weeks, her team had uncovered a massive stone wall, 30 meters long, 3 meters wide, dating to the 11th or 10th century BCE. In the following season, a second wall emerged, even larger, up to 6 meters wide in places. Both walls interlocked perfectly with the top of the stepped stone structure below. One complex, one construction phase, one king. Inside the fill, ornate ivory pieces, exotic imported goods, administrative seals, 2 clay seal impressions, naming officials identified by name in Jeremiah 37:3 and 38.1 as servants of King Zedekiah. The building was in royal use centuries after David. Think about what those 2 seal impressions mean. A bulla is a lump of clay pressed over the knot in a string that sealed a rolled document. When fire destroyed whatever building the documents were stored in, it hardened the clay and preserved the impressions. Jehucal, son of Shelemiah, Gedaliah, son of Pashur, both men serving the last king of Judah, in the building that scholars believe the first king of Judah's unified monarchy built. 6 centuries of unbroken royal use, attested by 2 lumps of burned clay the size of a thumbnail. The dating remains debated. Some scholars push the construction later. The evidence is extraordinary. The full consensus has not settled. That's honest archaeology. But here is what no one disputes. The stepped stone structure and the large walls above it represent one of the most significant monumental construction projects in Iron Age Judah. Whatever king built it, and the evidence points strongly toward the era of the United Monarchy, someone poured enormous resources into this narrow ridge and raised a compound that announced itself across the valley for centuries. And now, the discovery that changes everything you thought you knew about how this city was organized. In a parking lot. The Givati parking lot sits at the southwestern edge of the city of David, just south of the Dung Gate. Since 2007, it has been the site of the longest-running active excavation in Israel, co-directed by Professor Yuval Gadot and Dr. Yiftah Shalev of Tel Aviv University and the Israel Antiquities Authority. Year after year, layer by layer, century by century, this team has been working down through the accumulated occupation of this site. And in 2023, they published something that stopped the archaeological community. A moat, not a natural ravine, not erosion or geological subsidence. A man-made, rock-cut trench in the bedrock of Jerusalem, 35 meters wide, up to 9 meters deep, carved deliberately into the Melchizedek limestone of the ridge. The gradient of the southern wall was too steep to occur naturally in this type of rock. Someone with enormous labor, enormous resources, and the authority of a king behind them had carved this feature into the living stone. 35 meters is 115 feet wide. 9 meters deep is nearly 30 feet. Walk across a standard American football field end zone. That's roughly 10 meters. The moat was 3.5 of those, side by side. This was not a ditch. This was a canyon. Stand at the south lip of it. On your side, the city of David, the Jebusite stronghold, the stepped stone structure, the large stone structure, the royal residential compound. On the other side of the chasm, 35 meters away, the Ophel, the stepped approach northward toward the threshing floor and Mount Moriah, the hill where the temple would one day be built. The king's compound was physically separated from the holy mountain to the north by a chasm cut in the bedrock. Scholars had known for decades that something was wrong with the bedrock levels at this spot. Kathleen Kenyon's excavations in the 1960s had found lower than expected bedrock at the northern edge of the city of David. Rena Avner's work in 2003 confirmed the anomaly. Nobody had the full picture. The Givati team's excavation finally exposed the western cross-section of the feature, a 150-year archaeological mystery solved by removing a parking lot. The excavators declined to name a specific king, noting only that the construction dates to the Iron IIA period, the period generally associated with kings David and Solomon. But they were explicit about its significance. This moat is part of the monumental change that occurred in Jerusalem at the founding of the United Monarchy. The city had walls, the palace had a canyon, and on the south side of that canyon, buried 30 feet below the ground level where David and all the court of Israel once walked, 8 rooms sealed in darkness, waiting. In January 2025, the Israel Antiquities Authority published a finding that rewrites what we know about daily worship in the city of David. On the eastern slope, within Jerusalem Walls National Park, archaeologist Eli Shukran's team had been excavating a site first partially uncovered in 1909 by a British explorer named Montague Parker, who had come to Jerusalem searching for the Ark of the Covenant. He dug here. He came close to something extraordinary. He never understood what it was. Systematic excavation resumed in 2010, and what emerged across 15 years of careful work was this: 8 rock-hewn rooms covering 220 square meters. One room held an altar, a carved stone installation with a drainage channel cut into the floor to receive liquid offerings. Another room held a maseba, a standing stone, a physical marker of a place where God had been encountered. A third room held an oil press, a fourth, a wine press, and scattered throughout, cooking pots, storage jars bearing ancient Hebrew script, loom weights, scarabs, stamped seal impressions. The Israel Antiquities Authority characterized it directly, the only known ritual structure from this period in Jerusalem, and one of the few discovered in the land of Israel. First Temple period, active from the 10th century through the 8th, and then, abruptly, abandoned. The reason for the abandonment is recorded in the 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 4. Hezekiah, king of Judah, began his sweeping religious reforms, centralizing all worship at the temple, tearing down the high places, removing the standing stones, shutting down the neighborhood shrines. This was one of them, 8 rooms of prayer, sealed under a king's decree. This is what faith looked like on the slope below the palace. Not the smoke of the great bronze altar, not the priests in linen carrying burning coals, an oil press, a wine press, a standing stone worn smooth by generations of hands, a drainage channel for offerings pressed from the produce of a garden. This is the faith that built Jerusalem. Ordinary people, harvest to harvest, prayer cut into bedrock, and now everything arrives together. The tiny ridge, Joab in the dark of a water shaft. The stepped stone structure, 20 meters of fill and stone holding up a slope. A moat carved 35 meters into bedrock, invisible for 3 millennia. A palace where a woman drew an arrow on a map and said, "It's there," and was right. 8 sealed ritual rooms, and a threshing floor purchased after a plague on the hill just to the north. All of it asking the same question: why here? The strategic answers are real. The city was defensible. The spring guaranteed survival. Its location on the tribal boundary between Judah and Benjamin, belonging fully to neither, recorded in both Joshua 15:63 and Joshua 18:28, gave David a capital that no tribe could claim as their own. Jerusalem was neutral ground. It had belonged to no Israelite tribe because it had belonged to none of them for 400 years. That neutrality was shrewd, but strategy doesn't explain everything. Go back 1,000 years before David. Genesis 14:18-20. Abram returns from battle, and a man meets him, Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of God Most High. Bread and wine, a blessing from the priest of the Most High God on this same ridge. And Abram gives him 1/10 of everything, a tithe to a priest who holds no tribal office, exists in the text like a hinge between two covenants. Psalm 76:2 makes the link explicit. His abode has been established in Salem, his dwelling place in Zion. 1,000 years before David, this ridge already had its priest. And then, Genesis 22, God told Abraham to take Isaac to the land of Moriah, one of the mountains God would show him. The binding, the raised knife, the ram in the thicket. And Abraham named that mountain Adonai Yireh, the Lord will provide. 2 Chronicles chapter 3 verse 1 closes the circuit. Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to David, his father, at the place that David had appointed, on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. Same mountain, Abraham's sacrifice, Solomon's temple, the same ground, and between them, a man who didn't plan any of it. 2 Samuel 24. David numbered the people, a sin of pride, of self-sufficiency. A plague came, and 70,000 people died across Israel. The angel of the Lord stopped at a threshing floor on a hill just north of the city, just north of the Moat, on the slope up toward Moriah. David saw the angel standing there. He went to the owner, a man named Araunah, the Jebusite, and bought the ground for 50 shekels of silver. He built an altar. The plague stopped. I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God that cost me nothing. On Adonai Yireh, on the mountain Abraham had named. On the ground, 2 Chronicles identifies as Moriah, the place where God had stopped Abraham's hand 12 centuries before. David's altar stopped the dying. He didn't choose that ground deliberately. He bought it because a plague stopped there. A spontaneous act of obedience, of refusing to worship cheaply on a threshing floor on a hillside. And it turned out to be the most important real estate transaction in the history of the world. What archaeologists keep uncovering beneath Jerusalem is not the story of a king who built a city. It is the story of a city that was already prepared for a king. Read 2 Samuel 24 this week, the whole chapter. A sin, a plague, an angel standing on a hilltop, and a king who refused to worship cheaply. Then turn to Genesis 22 and read verse 14 slowly. Adonai Yireh, the Lord will provide. Abraham said it on the same mountain 12 centuries before David's altar stopped the dying. The ground is still speaking. What archaeologists keep finding beneath these streets is exactly what the scriptures have always been telling us. The Lord will provide. He already had.